In the summer of 1518, in the prosperous city of Strasbourg, a woman walked into the street and began to dance. She danced for hours, then days. Her feet bled. She collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise and continue dancing. Within a week, 34 others had joined her. Within a month, 400 people were locked in an uncontrollable dance that would kill dozens of them. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This is documented historical fact, recorded in city chronicles, physician reports, and church records. And here's what makes it truly disturbing. The city's official response was to build wooden stages, hire musicians, and encourage more dancing. The question isn't whether this happened. The question is why. And the answer reveals something deeply unsettling about the human mind, the power of belief, and what happens when an entire society reaches its breaking point. Because what occurred in Strasbourg that summer wasn't just a bizarre medical anomaly. It was a window into how communities collapse under pressure, and how the invisible forces of collective belief can override the most basic human instinct, the will to survive. By the end of this video, you'll understand why 400 people couldn't stop moving, even as it killed them. And you'll see why this 16th century mystery matters more today than ever before. To understand what happened in Strasbourg, you need to understand that 1518 wasn't just another year. It was the culmination of decades of accumulated horror. Strasbourg sat at the crossroads of the Holy Roman Empire, a free imperial city that answered to no prince or duke. With a population of around 20,000, it was wealthy by medieval standards, built on textile production and trade. Its citizens considered themselves sophisticated, educated, part of the new Renaissance world that was leaving medieval superstition behind. But beneath that veneer of prosperity, the city was breaking. The decade before 1518 had seen relentless famine, crop failures in 1493, 1502, and 1511 had hollowed out the lower classes. The winter of 1517 was particularly brutal. Chroniclers described people eating cats, rats, and unthawed animal carcasses to survive. A measure of grain that cost 15 shillings in 1515 now cost more than 100. The poor were dying in the streets. Disease followed hunger, as it always does. Smallpox swept through in 1516. Syphilis, a new and terrifying affliction that Europeans believed was divine punishment for sin, was epidemic. Leprosy, never fully gone, flared up again. The hospitals overflowed. And then there was the religious crisis. This was the eve of the Reformation. Martin Luther had just nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg the previous year. The Catholic Church's authority was fragmenting. People no longer knew what to believe, who to trust, or how to secure their salvation. The old certainties were collapsing. For the poor of Strasbourg, and by 1518, that meant the majority life had become unbearable. They worked until their bodies gave out. They watched their children starve. They buried family members by the dozens, and they had no idea when or if it would ever end. Into this powder keg walked a woman named Frau Troffea. We know almost nothing about her personally. The historical record doesn't preserve the stories of poor women. We don't know her age, her occupation, whether she had children. We know only that she lived in one of Strasbourg's poorer districts, and that on a hot day in mid-July 1518, something inside her broke. But before we get to what happened to her, you need to understand one more piece of context: the medieval mind's understanding of dancing, disease, and the supernatural. In the medieval worldview, there was no clean distinction between medicine, magic, and religion. Illness could be caused by demonic possession, divine punishment, astrological influences, or imbalanced humors. Often, it was a combination of all four. And dancing uncontrolled, compulsive dancing, had a specific meaning in this worldview. It was called choreomania, the dancing mania, and it was believed to be caused by street Vitus, an early Christian martyr who had the power to inflict a terrible curse. He could force people to dance against their will until they collapsed, went mad, or died. Why would a saint do this? As punishment for sin? As a warning to the unfaithful? As a reminder of the power of the divine over human flesh? There were shrines to Street Vitus throughout the region, places where the afflicted could go to beg for relief from the curse. Prayers, offerings, pilgrimages, these were the treatments. And people believed they worked, because sometimes they did. The dancers would stop, return to normal life, and thank the saint for his mercy. This wasn't superstition in the way we use the word today. This was the operating system of medieval consciousness, as real and reliable as germ theory is to us. Which brings us back to Frau Troffea, standing in a Strasbourg street in July 1518, as her feet begin to move. The exact date was the 14th of July, 1518. According to the Chronicle of Sebastian Brandt, a Strasbourg lawyer and scholar who documented the event, Frau Troffea began dancing in the narrow street where she lived. Not the joyful dancing of a celebration, something else, something frantic, repetitive, unceasing. Witnesses said she seemed unable to stop. Her face showed not joy but exhaustion, even terror. When concerned neighbors tried to restrain her, she fought them off and continued. When her husband tried to bring her inside, she pushed past him and returned to the street. She danced through the afternoon, through the evening, through the night. By the next morning, a crowd had gathered. In a city of 20,000, word travels fast. People came to stare, to whisper, to speculate. Some said she was drunk. Others said possessed. The more religious suggested it was Street Vitus's curse punishment for some hidden sin. Frau Troffea didn't speak, couldn't speak, perhaps. She just danced. By the third day, her feet were bleeding. Her clothes were soaked with sweat. She had taken no food, no water. Witnesses described her as appearing beside herself, trapped in a body that wouldn't obey her will. On the fourth day, the city council took notice. Strasbourg's magistrates were practical men, educated in the new humanist learning. They didn't jump to supernatural conclusions. They called for physicians. The doctors examined Frau Troffea, or tried to, since she wouldn't stop moving long enough for a proper assessment. Their diagnosis was based on Galenic medicine. Her blood had become overheated, creating an excess of choleric humor that manifested as uncontrollable movement. The treatment was cooling foods, rest, and isolation. It didn't work. By the sixth day, Frau Troffea was still dancing, and she was no longer alone. On July 20, a week after Frau Troffea began, the Chronicle records that 34 others had joined her. The exact mechanism of spread is unclear from the sources, but the pattern is consistent. One by one, people, mostly women, mostly from the poorer districts, began to dance. They converged in the streets and squares. They danced in front of churches. They danced until they collapsed, and when they woke, they danced again. The city council convened an emergency session. What was happening? Was it disease, possession, mass delusion? The physicians argued among themselves. Some maintained the hot blood theory. Others suggested astrological influences the planets in the wrong configuration. A few brave souls whispered about Street Vitus. But as July turned to August, the debate became irrelevant because the number of dancers kept growing. 50, 75, 100, and then something truly bizarre happened. The city decided to make it worse. By early August 1518, Strasbourg had a crisis on its hands. Approximately 100 people were now dancing in the streets, day and night. The city's normal functions were disrupting. Dancers blocked thoroughfares. Shops closed as proprietors joined the dance or stayed home in fear. The noise, the constant shuffle of feet, the moans and cries of the dancers made sleep impossible for entire neighborhoods. The city council met again. The physicians presented their findings, and they made a decision that, to modernize, seems insane. They decided the dancers needed to dance more. The official reasoning went like this. According to medical theory, the hot blood causing the compulsion could only be cooled through movement. The patients needed to dance themselves to exhaustion, to sweat out the excess heat and restore balance to their humors. Stopping them would trap the hot blood in their bodies, leading to worse outcomes, madness, permanent damage, death. So the city took action. They cleared several large spaces for dancing. They built wooden stages in the grain market and the horse market. And this is documented in the city's financial records. They hired professional musicians to provide music for the dancers. Pipers, drummers, fiddlers. The city paid them from the municipal treasury to play from dawn until dusk, encouraging the afflicted to continue their frantic movements. The result was predictable. The dancing intensified. With official sanction and musical accompaniment, more people joined. The psychological barrier had broken. If the city authorities thought dancing was the cure, then dancing must be acceptable, even necessary. By mid-August, chroniclers put the number at around 400 people in the heart of Strasbourg, unable to stop moving. The scenes witnesses described are almost hallucinogenic. Dancers with bleeding feet, leaving red tracks on the cobblestones. Women who'd torn their clothes in their frantic movements. Men who danced for so long they'd lost control of their bowels. The professional musicians, hired to help, now seemed like devils driving the damned to greater torments. And people began to die. The death toll is disputed among historians. Some contemporary sources claim 15 per day at the peak. Others suggest lower numbers. The city's burial records from this period are incomplete, making precise calculation impossible. But the consensus among modern scholars is that dozens died, perhaps as many as 100 over the course of the outbreak. The causes of death were varied. Heart attacks and strokes were common, as physically exhausted bodies simply gave out. Some dancers died from dehydration and heat exhaustion in the August sun. A few suffered fatal falls during their convulsive movements. At least one chronicle mentions dancers dying from exhaustion and lack of sleep, suggesting their bodies simply shut down after days of continuous movement. The city began to panic. What had seemed like a medical curiosity, then a manageable crisis, was now a full-scale catastrophe. The hired musicians fell silent. The stages stood empty. And the city council, finally recognizing their mistake, reversed course. On August 31, they issued a proclamation. All public dancing was banned. The musicians were dismissed. The stages were torn down. Anyone found dancing in the streets would be forcibly removed to a hospital or prison. But it was too late. The dancing had taken on a life of its own. By September 1518, Strasbourg had abandoned medical solutions and turned to the supernatural. The city council, dominated by Catholics despite the spreading Reformation, formally acknowledged what the common people had been saying all along. This was Street Vitus's curse, and if a saint had caused it, only a saint could cure it. The solution was pilgrimage. A shrine to Street Vitus existed in the nearby village of Saverne, in the Vosges Mountains. The council organized a mass pilgrimage, forcibly transporting the most severe dancers, those who seemed most likely to die, to the shrine. The journey was documented in painful detail by witnesses. Dancers had to be tied to wagons to prevent them from injuring themselves during transport. Some continued their frantic movements even while bound. At the shrine, priests performed special masses. The dancers were made to stand before the altar while prayers were recited. They were given holy water, blessed by Street Vitus himself, or so the faithful believed. Small wooden statuettes of the saint were placed in their hands. They were told to repent their sins, to beg for mercy, to promise amendment of life. And remarkably, for many of them, it worked. One by one, the dancers at Saverne stopped. Their bodies grew still. They collapsed into normal sleep for the first time in weeks. When they woke, they were weak, traumatized, but the compulsion was gone. Back in Strasbourg, word of the cures spread. More dancers were taken to Saverne. others began to stop on their own, as if the spell had been broken by the knowledge that escape was possible. By late September, the number of active dancers had dropped to a handful dozen. By October, the crisis was effectively over. Frau Troffea, the woman who started it all, disappears from the historical record at this point. We don't know if she was taken to Saverne, if she recovered, if she died. Like most poor women in history, once her usefulness to the narrative ended, so did any interest in preserving her story. But the questions remained. What had actually happened? Why had it stopped? The city's official explanation was clear. Street Vitus had punished the city for its sins, and only through proper supplication had the curse been lifted. This became the accepted narrative, repeated in chronicles and histories for decades afterward. But even at the time, some observers weren't satisfied with supernatural explanations. Paracelsus, the famous physician and alchemist, was practicing medicine nearby during this period. Though he didn't witness the dancing plague directly, he later wrote about choreomania, arguing that such episodes had natural causes rooted in the imagination. When the mind was sufficiently disturbed by fear, stress, or religious fervor, he suggested it could create physical symptoms that seemed beyond rational explanation. He was closer to the truth than he knew. In the aftermath of the dancing plague, Strasbourg tried to prevent any recurrence. The city council enacted new laws against public dancing, except during officially sanctioned festivals. They increased funding for hospitals and poor relief, recognizing, however dimly, that the afflicted had been disproportionately from the impoverished classes. They commissioned special masses and religious processions to ward off future divine punishments. None of it addressed the root causes: the grinding poverty, the food insecurity, the disease, the social dislocation of a world in transformation. And so variations of the same crisis kept happening. Historians have documented similar dancing manias throughout medieval and early modern Europe. Aachen in 1374, Cologne the same year. Strasbourg itself had experienced a smaller outbreak in 1418, exactly a century before. The same pattern repeated: social stress, sudden onset, contagious spread, eventual religious resolution. What's striking is how the 1518 event marked a turning point. It was one of the last major outbreaks of its kind. Within decades, the Reformation would fundamentally change how Northern Europeans understood the relationship between the divine and the physical. The rise of Protestant theology, with its rejection of saints and intercession, made the old explanations untenable. But it wasn't just theology that changed. The entire epistemic framework, the way people understood causation, disease, and the self, was shifting. The dancing plague of 1518 occurred at the precise moment when medieval consciousness was giving way to early modern rationality. The dancers were caught between two worlds, one where curses and saints were real, and another where they would become metaphors and myths. So what actually happened? Modern historians and psychologists have converged on an explanation: mass psychogenic illness, also called epidemic hysteria or conversion disorder. Here's how it works. Under extreme and prolonged stress, the human mind can convert psychological distress into physical symptoms. In individuals, this might manifest as paralysis, blindness, or seizures, real physical effects with no organic cause. But in groups sharing common cultural beliefs and stressors, these symptoms can spread through social contagion. The key factor is belief. The people of Strasbourg believed in Street Vitus's curse. They believed dancing could be inflicted supernaturally. So when one person began dancing uncontrollably, others interpreted their own stress-induced symptoms through that lens. The more people who joined, the more real the phenomenon became, creating a feedback loop of belief and behavior. This explains everything. Why it affected primarily the poor and women who faced the most severe stress. Why it spread through observation and proximity. Why it responded to religious intervention, which addressed the underlying belief system. And why it stopped when collective belief shifted. It wasn't ergot poisoning, the symptoms don't match, and it wouldn't explain the selective pattern. It wasn't demonic possession, there's no such thing. It wasn't deliberate fraud. People died, and no one had anything to gain. It was something more disturbing, a demonstration that the boundary between mind and body, between belief and reality, is far more porous than we like to think. If you think this is just a bizarre medieval footnote with no modern relevance, consider the following cases. Tanganyika, 1962. At a mission school for girls, a student began laughing and couldn't stop. Within hours, 95 of the school's 159 students were affected. The school closed. The laughing spread to the students' home villages. Over the next 18 months, 14 schools were shut down, and thousands of people experienced uncontrollable laughter, crying, fainting, and respiratory problems. The epidemic ended only when school closures became widespread enough to break the social contagion. Leroy, New York, 2011 to 2012. 12 teenage girls at the same high school developed sudden onset tics, verbal outbursts, and seizure-like symptoms. Medical tests found nothing. Environmental investigations found nothing. One by one, they'd been afflicted after seeing others exhibit symptoms. The diagnosis: conversion disorder, modern medicine's term for mass psychogenic illness. The treatment involved separating the girls, limiting social media exposure to the symptoms, and cognitive behavioral therapy. Havana, Cuba, 2016 to 2018. U.S. Embassy personnel reported hearing strange sounds and subsequently developed headaches, dizziness, cognitive problems, and other symptoms. The Havana Syndrome made international headlines. Theories ranged from sonic weapons to microwave attacks. Comprehensive studies by the National Academy of Sciences and other bodies eventually concluded that while some cases might have organic causes, the epidemic pattern was consistent with mass psychogenic illness triggered by stress, expectation, and social contagion.